When Dr. Grace Thornton stepped off the train in Cedar Ridge, Wyoming, she carried more than just medical supplies in her worn leather bag. She carried the weight of a secret that could destroy everything she'd worked for. Trained as one of the first female physicians in Boston, she'd been forced to flee west after a patient's death shattered her confidence and her career. Now posing as a simple mail-order bride, she'd come to marry Nathan Crawford, a rancher desperate for help caring for his mysteriously ill sister. What Grace didn't expect was to walk into a community terrorized by a corrupt doctor whose medical incompetence was literally killing people. When Sarah Crawford's condition suddenly worsens and only emergency surgery can save her life, Grace must choose between maintaining her disguise and revealing the truth that could either save a life or destroy her forever. This is a story of courage in the face of prejudice, love that sees beyond appearances, and the power of knowledge to heal both bodies and hearts. Like and subscribe for more inspiring Western romance stories that prove true duty comes from the courage to serve others. She's not a real doctor. When mail-order bride's secret almost cost a life, the Wyoming spring morning was crisp with possibility as Grace Thornton gathered her courage along with her medical bag. Through the train window, she could see Cedar Ridge spread before her, a collection of wooden buildings that looked substantial enough to support a real community, unlike some of the frontier towns that were little more than temporary camps. At 26, she'd learned that starting over required more than changing locations. It required the kind of transformation that went deeper than new clothes or a different name. But sometimes when the alternative was living with unbearable guilt, transformation was the only choice that made sense. She checked that her most precious possession was secure, not the medical instruments hidden in her bag, though those were valuable enough, but the letter from Nathan Crawford that had brought her here. His request had been different from other mail-order bride advertisements. Instead of seeking a wife for companionship or domestic help, he'd specifically requested someone with medical knowledge to help care for his invalid sister. That request had given Grace hope that perhaps her skills could still serve a purpose, even if she could never again practice medicine officially. Cedar Ridge, the conductor called. End of the line. Grace smoothed her traveling dress, a practical gray wool that disguised her fuller figure while maintaining respectability, and prepared to meet the man who would either become her salvation or her next disappointment. The platform was busier than she'd expected, with several people clearly waiting for the train's passengers. She recognized Nathan Crawford immediately from his careful description, tall and lean with dark hair, and the weathered look of a man who spent his life working outdoors. But it was his expression that caught her attention, a combination of hope and desperation that spoke of someone carrying burdens too heavy for one person alone. "Miss Thornton." He approached with his hat in his hands, his voice carefully polite. "Mr. Crawford, thank you for meeting me. Of course, I hope the journey wasn't too difficult." "Not at all. I'm used to traveling." It was true, though probably not in the way he imagined. She'd spent her medical training moving between hospitals and clinics, learning from any physician, willing to teach a woman the skills traditionally reserved for men. Behind Nathan, she could see other people watching their meeting with the kind of intense curiosity that marks small communities. A few faces looked welcoming, but others carried the skeptical expression of people who'd seen too many failed arrangements between mail-order couples. "My wagon's just over here," Nathan said, gesturing toward a sturdy vehicle designed more for practicality than comfort. "Sarah's eager to meet you, but I wanted to prepare you for her condition. You mentioned in your letters that she's been an invalid since childhood." Nathan's expression grew pained. "Since she was 4 years old, a fall from a horse damaged her spine. She's been unable to walk since then, and lately—" He trailed off, but Grace could see the worry in his eyes. "Lately, her condition has been getting worse. Dr. Walsh says it's natural progression, that we should prepare for the inevitable." Grace felt a familiar chill. In her experience, when doctors started talking about inevitable progression, it often meant they'd given up trying to understand what was really wrong. "What kind of symptoms?" Nathan looked surprised by the directness of her question. "Headaches, fatigue, difficulty breathing sometimes. Dr. Walsh says it's her body failing as she gets older." None of those symptoms necessarily followed from spinal injury, and Grace found herself mentally cataloging possible diagnoses before she caught herself. She was here as a bride, not a physician. She had to remember that. The ride to the Crawford Ranch took them through country that was both beautiful and harsh. Rolling hills dotted with cattle, distant mountains, purple against the sky, and the kind of vastness that either inspired or overwhelmed newcomers to the territory. "It's beautiful," Grace said, meaning it. "It's isolated," Nathan replied. "The nearest neighbor is 5 miles away, and town is an hour's ride on a good day." Well, that doesn't bother me. I prefer places where people have to be genuine because there's no one else around to impress. Nathan glanced at her with what might have been approval. "That's a practical way to look at it." "I've learned to be practical. It's usually more useful than being romantic." "Is that why you answered my advertisement? Because it seemed practical." It was a fair question, and one Grace had been preparing to answer since accepting his proposal. "I answered because you were honest about what you needed. Too many men advertise for wives when what they really want is unpaid housekeepers. You were clear that you needed a partner to help with your sister's wear. And you're not disappointed that this isn't a romantic courtship." Grace considered the question seriously. "Mr. Crawford, I'm 26 years old and have spent most of my adult life focused on learning skills rather than attracting suitors. Romance is a luxury I've learned to live without. Partnership and mutual respect are necessities I can't live without." Nathan was quiet for a moment, clearly processing her answer. "That's a very honest response. Would you have preferred a dishonest one?" "No, honesty is refreshing." The ranch, when it came into view, was larger and more prosperous looking than Grace had expected. The main house was a solid log structure with a wide porch and large windows that would let in plenty of light. The outbuildings were well maintained and the corrals held horses that looked healthy and well cared for. "It's impressive," she said truthfully. "It was our father's dream. He homesteaded this land when I was 10 and Sarah was a baby, built it into something that could support a family for generations." Past tense. "He and mother died of pneumonia 8 years ago, left me to carry on their work and care for Sarah." The weight of that responsibility was evident in Nathan's voice. At 25, he'd become both ranch owner and caregiver to a sister who required constant attention. Inside the house, Grace found a space that was clean, but clearly organized around the needs of someone who couldn't move freely. Furniture was arranged to create clear pathways, and she noticed a wheeled chair near the fireplace that was obviously built for someone who spent most of their time sitting. "Sarah," Nathan called gently, "Miss Thornton has arrived." The young woman who emerged from what was obviously a ground floor bedroom was nothing like what Grace had expected from Nathan's description of an invalid. Sarah Crawford was 19 years old with intelligent green eyes and auburn hair that caught the light streaming through the windows. She moved herself in her wheeled chair with practiced efficiency, and her expression showed curiosity rather than the resigned suffering Grace had seen in many chronic patients. "Miss Thornton," Sarah said with a smile that was genuinely welcoming, "I'm so glad you're here. Nathan has been impossible to live with while waiting for your arrival." "Sarah," Nathan said with embarrassment, but Grace could see the affection between the siblings. "I'm happy to meet you, Sarah, and please call me Grace." "Thank you, and you must call me Sarah, of course." The young woman studied Grace's face with obvious intelligence. "Nathan tells me you have medical knowledge. I hope you won't find me too much of a burden." "From what I can see, you manage your situation with remarkable independence." "That's not a burden, it's an inspiration." Sarah's face lit up at the compliment. "Most people either treat me like I'm made of glass or like I'm mentally deficient because my legs don't work. It's refreshing to meet someone who sees me as a person first." Grace felt an immediate connection with the younger woman. Sarah had the kind of sharp intelligence that would have made her a formidable physician if she'd been born in different circumstances. "Would you mind if I asked about your condition? Nathan mentioned you have been experiencing new symptoms." "Not at all. I've been having terrible headaches, especially in the mornings. And sometimes I get dizzy when I try to sit up too quickly. Dr. Walsh says it's normal deterioration." Grace felt her professional instincts stirring. Morning headaches and orthostatic dizziness weren't typical symptoms of spinal injury, and they certainly weren't signs of inevitable decline. "How long have you been experiencing these symptoms?" "About 6 months. They've been getting gradually worse. And Dr. Walsh has been treating them how." Sarah exchanged a glance with her brother. "He's given me medication to help with the pain, a tonic that he mixes specially." Grace felt a warning bell in her mind. Special tonics from frontier doctors were often little more than alcohol and laudanum, potentially dangerous combinations that could mask symptoms rather than treat underlying conditions. Does the tonic help with all your symptoms or just the pain? It makes me sleepy, which helps me ignore the headaches, but it doesn't really fix anything. That was exactly what Grace had been afraid of hearing, but she had to be careful not to overstep her bounds as a bride rather than a physician. "Oh, well," she said diplomatically, "perhaps we can work together to make you more comfortable. I've learned some techniques for managing chronic pain that don't rely entirely on medication." Sarah's face brightened with interest. "You mean exercises, treatments?" "Perhaps, but first I'd like to get to know you better and understand exactly what you're experiencing." Over dinner that evening, Grace learned more about the Crawford family situation. Nathan had been managing the ranch alone for 8 years while caring for Sarah, whose condition had been slowly worsening despite Dr. Walsh's treatments. The isolation of ranch life meant that Sarah had few opportunities for social interaction, and Nathan had little time for anything beyond work and caregiving. "It's not much of a life for either of us," Nathan admitted as they finished their simple meal. "Sarah deserves better than being stuck on a remote ranch with only her brother for company, and I—" He trailed off, but Grace could finish the sentence. Nathan had sacrificed his own chances for marriage and family to care for his sister. "What about you, Grace?" Sarah asked. "What brought you west? Nathan's letter mentioned you had medical training." Grace had prepared for this question, but she still felt uncomfortable with the partial truth she'd decided to tell. "I worked with a physician in Boston for several years. When he passed away, I found myself without employment and decided to start fresh, somewhere new." It wasn't technically a lie, but it left out everything important: her years of formal medical education, her experience treating patients independently, and the crisis of confidence that had driven her away from medicine. "What kind of medical work did you do?" Sarah pressed with obvious interest. "General practice, some surgery, treatment of women's ailments, and childhood diseases." "Surgery?" Nathan looked surprised. "You actually perform surgical procedures?" Grace realized she'd revealed more than intended. Most women with medical training in the 1880s were limited to nursing and midwifery. Surgical experience suggested formal training that was virtually impossible for women to obtain. "I assisted with surgical procedures," she corrected carefully. "The physician I worked with believed in thorough training for all his assistants." Sarah's eyes lit up with understanding. "He sounds like a progressive man. Most doctors won't even let women observe surgical procedures, let alone assist." He was unusual in that regard. After dinner, Nathan showed Grace to her room while Sarah retired early, complaining of another headache. The bedroom was simple but comfortable, with a window that looked out over the mountains and a small desk that would be perfect for writing letters or keeping medical notes. "Grace," Nathan said as he prepared to leave her to settle in, "I want you to know how grateful I am that you're here. Sarah hasn't been this animated in months. Just having someone new to talk to has lifted her spirits. She's a remarkable young woman. Her intelligence is obvious, and her attitude toward her condition is inspiring. She's always been the strong one, even after the accident. Sometimes I think she's been taking care of me more than I've been taking care of her." Grace could see the guilt and exhaustion in Nathan's expression, the toll of 8 years spent as a sole caregiver while trying to manage a demanding ranch. "Nathan," she said gently, "you've done an extraordinary job caring for Sarah under difficult circumstances, but you don't have to carry that burden alone anymore. I don't want you to feel like you're being trapped into more than you bargained for. Sarah's care can be demanding, especially when she's having bad days. I didn't come here expecting an easy life. I came here hoping to be useful. Caring for Sarah would be a privilege, not a burden." Nathan studied her face for a long moment. "You really mean that, don't you?" "I really do." That night, as Grace settled into her new room, she reflected on the complex situation she'd entered. Nathan was clearly a good man who'd sacrificed his own happiness to care for his sister, but the isolation and responsibility were wearing him down. Sarah was intelligent and spirited despite her physical limitations, but her symptoms suggested medical problems that weren't being properly addressed. And somewhere in Cedar Ridge was Dr. Walsh, whose treatments seemed to be making Sarah worse rather than better. Grace opened her medical bag and pulled out the diagnostic instruments she'd brought, despite knowing she couldn't use them openly. But maybe if she was careful, she could find ways to help Sarah without revealing the full extent of her training. The next morning, she woke to the sound of Nathan moving around outside, tending to the animals that were his livelihood. Through her window, she could see him working with practiced efficiency, but she noticed he favored his left shoulder in a way that suggested old injury. In the kitchen, she found Sarah already awake despite the early hours, sitting in her chair and struggling with what was obviously a severe headache. "Good morning," Grace said softly. "How are you feeling?" "Awful," Sarah admitted. "The headaches are always worse in the morning, but today's particularly bad." Grace moved closer, noting the way Sarah held her head and the slight tremor in her hands. "May I take a look at you?" "Sometimes there are simple things that can help with headache pain." Sarah nodded gratefully, and Grace gently examined her neck and scalp, feeling for tension and areas of tenderness. What she found made her heart race with recognition. "Sarah," she said carefully, "have you noticed any changes in your vision lately? Blurriness or difficulty focusing?" "Some, yes. Dr. Walsh says it's related to the headaches." Grace felt her professional instincts taking over despite her efforts to remain cautious. The combination of morning headaches, visual disturbances, and progressive weakness suggested increased intracranial pressure, a potentially serious condition that required immediate medical attention. "Has Dr. Walsh examined your eyes recently, looked into them with special instruments?" "He looked at them last month, but he said everything was normal." Grace doubted that any examination had been thorough enough to detect the signs she was beginning to suspect, but she couldn't reveal her concerns without admitting to medical knowledge beyond what she'd claimed. "Sarah," she said carefully, "would you be willing to let me try some techniques I'd learned for managing headache pain? They're simple and safe, but they might provide some relief. Anything that might help. The tonics Dr. Walsh gives me make me so drowsy that I can't think clearly." Grace spent the next hour working with Sarah, using gentle massage techniques and positioning strategies that could help reduce headache pain without medication. As she worked, she observed symptoms that confirmed her growing suspicions about the true nature of Sarah's condition. This wasn't the natural progression of spinal injury. This was something treatable, possibly something that had been developing for months while being misdiagnosed and improperly treated. When Nathan returned for the midday meal, he found Sarah sitting straighter than she had in weeks, her headache reduced to a manageable level. "How did you do that?" he asked Grace with amazement. "Sometimes simple techniques can be very effective," Grace replied diplomatically. "The key is understanding what's causing the discomfort in the first place." Dr. Walsh never mentioned anything about positioning or massage. Different physicians have different approaches to treatment. Nathan studied Grace's face with growing curiosity. "You learned these techniques from your employer in Boston." "Among other things, yes." But even as she deflected his questions, Grace knew she was facing an impossible situation. Sarah's symptoms were worsening, and the treatments she was receiving from Dr. Walsh were at best ineffective and at worst dangerous. If Grace's suspicions were correct, Sarah needed immediate medical intervention from someone with surgical experience, someone exactly like the physician Grace had trained to become, but could no longer claim to be. That afternoon, as Sarah napped peacefully for the first time in weeks, thanks to Grace's interventions, Nathan asked the question Grace had been dreading. "Grace," he said quietly, "exactly what kind of medical training did you receive in Boston?" Grace met his eyes, seeing intelligence and growing suspicion there. Nathan Crawford wasn't a man who could be fooled indefinitely, especially when his sister's welfare was at stake. "More than I've admitted," she said finally, "but less than Sarah might need." "What does that mean?" Grace took a deep breath, preparing to share at least part of the truth that could either save Sarah's life or destroy her own chance at a new beginning. "It means," she said carefully, "that I may not be the simple bride you thought you were getting, and Sarah may not be suffering from the condition Dr. Walsh thinks she has." Nathan was quiet for a long moment, clearly processing the implications of her words. "Are you saying you're a physician?" he asked finally. "I'm saying I have diagnostic skills that might be able to help Sarah, but using those skills could put all of us in a very difficult position." "What kind of difficult position?" Grace looked out at the mountains, gathering courage for what she had to say next. "The kind where we have to choose between following social conventions and saving a life." Nathan followed her gaze to the distant peaks, then back to her face. "Grace," he said quietly, "if you can help my sister, social conventions can go to hell." It was exactly what she'd hoped to hear and exactly what she'd been afraid of. Because helping Sarah might require revealing the full truth about who Grace really was, and that truth could destroy everything they were trying to build together. But as she looked at Nathan's determined expression and thought about Sarah's worsening condition, Grace realized that some truths were too important to keep hidden. Tomorrow she would begin the careful process of diagnosing what was really wrong with Sarah Crawford. And if her suspicions proved correct, she would have to decide whether saving a life was worth risking her own future. The next morning brought news that confirmed Grace's worst fears about the medical care available in Cedar Ridge. Mrs. Emma Hartwell, the town's leading citizen and unofficial coordinator of community health matters, arrived at the ranch with word that another patient of Dr. Walsh's had died unexpectedly. "Poor Martha Jenkins," Mrs. Hartwell said, as she accepted Grace's offer of coffee. She'd been under Dr. Walsh's care for months for what he said was female hysteria, found dead in her bed yesterday morning. Grace felt her professional instincts immediately alert. What were her symptoms? Headaches, fatigue, difficulty concentrating. Dr. Walsh had been treating her with his special tonic, but she kept getting worse instead of better. The symptoms were disturbingly similar to what Sarah had been experiencing. Grace exchanged glances with Nathan, who was clearly thinking the same thing. "How many patients has Dr. Walsh lost this winter?" Grace asked carefully. Mrs. Hartwell's expression grew troubled. "More than seems natural for a town this size, but he says it's been a particularly harsh season and people are more susceptible to illness." "What kinds of illnesses?" "Various ailments. He seems to see a lot of nervous conditions and female complaints. Says frontier life is hard on women's delicate constitutions." Grace bit back her immediate response to that assessment. In her experience, frontier life was hard on everyone, but women often bore additional burdens while having less access to proper medical care. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said diplomatically, "have you noticed whether Dr. Walsh's treatments seem to help people, or do they tend to get worse under his care?" Mrs. Hartwell looked surprised by the directness of the question. "Well, it's not my place to question a trained physician's methods." "Of course not. I was just curious because I have some medical experience, and I've noticed that different approaches work better for different people." "You have medical experience?" Mrs. Hartwell's interest sharpened immediately. "What kind of experience?" Grace was saved from answering by Sarah's appearance from her bedroom, moving slowly in her chair and obviously suffering from another severe headache. "Good morning, Mrs. Hartwell," Sarah managed, though Grace could see the effort it cost her. "Oh, my dear, you look terrible," Mrs. Hartwell said with genuine concern. "Is Dr. Walsh's new tonic not helping? It makes me sleepy, but the headaches keep getting worse." Mrs. Hartwell turned to Grace with a meaningful look. Perhaps someone with medical experience could offer a different perspective on Sarah's treatment. It was clearly a test, and Grace realized that Mrs. Hartwell was more observant than she'd initially appeared. The older woman had noticed the same patterns Grace had seen and was hoping for confirmation of her own suspicions about Dr. Walsh's competence. "I'd be happy to try some alternative approaches," Grace said carefully. "Sometimes simple techniques can be surprisingly effective." She spent the next hour working with Sarah again, this time with Mrs. Hartwell observing. As she gently examined Sarah's neck, head, and eyes, she confirmed her growing suspicions about the true nature of the young woman's condition. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said finally, "would you mind if I asked you some questions about other patients Dr. Walsh has been treating?" "What kind of questions?" "I'm wondering if there might be patterns in the symptoms he's been seeing. Sometimes illnesses that appear unrelated can actually have common causes." Mrs. Hartwell looked intrigued. "What kind of common causes?" "Well, for instance, if multiple people are experiencing headaches, vision problems, and fatigue, it might suggest environmental factors, or," Grace paused, choosing her words carefully, "or systematic problems with treatment approaches." "You're suggesting Dr. Walsh might be misdiagnosing people?" "I'm suggesting it might be worth considering alternative explanations for why so many patients aren't improving under his care." Mrs. Hartwell was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the implications of questioning established medical authority. "Miss Thornton," she said finally, "if you have concerns about Dr. Walsh's treatments, perhaps you should discuss them with him directly." "Perhaps I should. Would it be possible to arrange a meeting?" "I'm sure it would. In fact, he'll be making his weekly rounds tomorrow. I could suggest that he stop by to check on Sarah. After Mrs. Hartwell left, Nathan turned to Grace with obvious concern. Are you sure you want to confront Dr. Walsh directly, if he's as protective of his practice as most frontier doctors? Nathan, I think Sarah's condition is serious enough that we can't afford to worry about Dr. Walsh's professional sensibilities. What exactly do you think is wrong with her? Grace had been dreading this conversation, but Sarah's worsening symptoms made it inevitable. I think Sarah has increased intracranial pressure, probably caused by a buildup of fluid in her brain. Nathan stared at her in shock. Fluid in her brain. How could that happen? It can be caused by various things: infection, injury, blockages in the normal drainage system. The important thing is that it's often treatable if caught in time. Treatable how? Surgery in most cases, a procedure to relieve the pressure and restore normal fluid drainage. Surgery, Nathan's voice was sharp with alarm. You're talking about operating on her brain? I'm talking about a procedure that could save her life. Nathan, the symptoms. Sarah's been experiencing the morning headaches, the vision problems, the progressive weakness. They're classic signs of increased intracranial pressure. If it's not treated, it will continue to worsen. Nathan was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling to process this information. How do you know all this? He asked finally. This isn't the kind of knowledge a physician's assistant would have. Grace met his gaze steadily. You're right, it's not. Then what kind of knowledge is it? Grace took a deep breath, preparing to reveal more of the truth than she'd ever intended. It's the kind of knowledge a trained physician would have, the kind of knowledge I have. Nathan's expression went through a series of changes: surprise, confusion, and finally a kind of careful hope. You're saying you're actually a doctor? I'm saying I have medical training that goes far beyond what I admitted in my letters. I have experience diagnosing and treating the kinds of conditions Sarah is suffering from. Why didn't you tell me this from the beginning? Grace looked out at the mountains, gathering courage for the complete honesty this conversation required. Because female physicians aren't accepted in most places, especially not on the frontier. Because admitting my real qualifications would have meant admitting I was running from something. And because she paused, the hardest part of the truth still to come. Because the last time I operated on a patient with a condition similar to Sarah's, they died on the table. And I've been afraid to pick up a scalpel ever since. Nathan absorbed this revelation in silence, clearly trying to understand all the implications. The patient died because of something you did wrong. The patient died because the condition was too advanced by the time I was called in. But I've spent the last 6 months questioning every decision I made, wondering if there was something I could have done differently. And now you think Sarah has the same condition. I think Sarah has a treatable form of the same basic problem. But Nathan, I also think she's running out of time. The longer we wait, the more difficult treatment becomes. Nathan was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. If you operate on Sarah and she dies, I'll have lost the only family I have left. If I don't operate on Sarah and her condition continues to worsen, you'll lose her anyway. But slowly and with months of suffering, that could be prevented. And if Dr. Walsh is right, if her condition really is just the natural progression of her spinal injury, then my diagnosis is wrong, and we'll have learned that through proper examination rather than assumptions. Nathan looked towards Sarah's room, where they could hear her moving around despite the obvious pain she was in. What would you need to do to confirm your diagnosis? I'd need to perform a thorough neurological examination, including tests that Dr. Walsh may not have done. I'd also need to examine her more carefully for signs of increased pressure. And if your diagnosis is confirmed, then we'd need to decide whether to attempt surgical intervention or watch her condition continue to deteriorate. Nathan stood and walked to the window, looking out at the ranch that had been his life's work and his burden for so long. Grace, he said finally, if you can save Sarah's life, I don't care what it costs or what people think. But I need to know, do you really believe you can help her? Grace considered the question with the careful honesty it deserved. I believe I can diagnose her condition accurately. I believe I have the skills to perform the necessary surgery if it's indicated. But I can't promise outcomes, Nathan. Surgery always carries risks, especially under the frontier conditions. What are her chances without surgery? If my diagnosis is correct, without treatment, her condition will continue to worsen until, Grace paused, but Nathan needed to hear the truth, until the increased pressure causes permanent brain damage or death. Nathan turned back to face her. Then we don't really have a choice, do we? There's always a choice. But some choices are between bad outcomes and potentially good ones. When would you want to do the examination? As soon as possible. And Nathan, there's something else. If I'm right about Sarah's condition, I'm also probably right about Dr. Walsh's competence. A properly trained physician would have recognized these symptoms months ago. You think he's incompetent? I think he's either incompetent or he's deliberately ignoring symptoms he doesn't know how to treat. Either way, it's dangerous for the people in this community. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of an approaching wagon. Through the window, they could see Dr. Walsh arriving earlier than expected, accompanied by Sheriff Tom Brennan. "That's not a social call," Nathan said grimly. Dr. Ezra Walsh was a thin, nervous man in his 40s, with the kind of furtive manner that has suggested someone with secrets to hide. Sheriff Brennan looked uncomfortable, as if he'd been reluctantly dragged into a situation he didn't entirely understand. "Mr. Crawford," Dr. Walsh said as he climbed down from his wagon, "I understand you have a new bride with medical pretensions." The word pretensions was clearly calculated as an insult, and Grace felt her professional pride bristle at the dismissal. "Dr. Walsh," Nathan replied evenly, "this is my wife, Grace. Grace Dr. Walsh provides medical care for our community." "Miss Thornton," Dr. Walsh said pointedly, using her unmarried name, "I've heard you've been offering medical advice to people who should be under proper physician care. I've been helping my sister-in-law manage her pain using techniques I learned in Boston. Techniques that contradict my prescribed treatment plan. Techniques that seem to be more effective than your prescribed treatment plan." This challenge was direct enough to make Sheriff Brennan shift uncomfortably, and Dr. Sarah Walsh's face reddened with anger. "Young woman, I don't know what kind of quackery you learned back east, but in this territory, medical practice is regulated by law. Only licensed physicians are permitted to diagnose and treat medical conditions. And I suppose you're a licensed physician?" The question seemed to catch Walsh off guard. "Of course I'm licensed." "Licensed by whom and when, and where did you receive your medical training?" Grace's questions were delivered with the quiet authority of someone who understood exactly what proper medical credentials looked like. Walsh's hesitation before answering was telling. "I received my training at respected Eastern institutions," he said finally. "My credentials are properly filed with territorial authorities." "I'd be interested to see those credentials. As someone who's worked with properly trained physicians, I'm always curious about different educational approaches." Walsh's eyes narrowed with suspicion and something that might have been fear. "Sheriff Brennan," he said, turning away from Grace, "this woman has been practicing medicine without a license. I want her arrested." Sheriff Brennan looked uncomfortable with the request. "Dr. Walsh, from what I understand, she's just been helping her sister-in-law with headache pain. That's not really practicing medicine. She's been contradicting my professional medical advice and encouraging patients to ignore my prescribed treatments." "Has she been charging money for medical services?" the sheriff asked. "That's not the point." "Actually, Sheriff, that is exactly the point," Grace interrupted. "Under territorial law, medical practice is defined as the diagnosis and treatment of medical conditions for compensation. I haven't diagnosed anyone, and I haven't charged anyone for anything." Both Walsh and Brennan looked surprised by her knowledge of legal definitions. "However," Grace continued, "if Dr. Walsh wants to discuss medical credentials and proper training, I'd be happy to have that conversation." "What do you mean?" Brennan asked. "I mean that anyone practicing medicine in this territory should be able to provide proof of their training and licensing. If Dr. Walsh wants to question my qualifications, perhaps we should examine everyone's qualifications." Walsh's face had gone pale. "This is ridiculous. I don't have to justify my credentials to some mail-order bride with delusions of medical knowledge." "Then perhaps," Grace said quietly, "you could explain to Sheriff Brennan why so many of your patients have been dying lately." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Sheriff Brennan looked sharply at both Walsh and Grace. "What's she talking about, Doc?" "She's talking nonsense. People die, Sheriff. That's the nature of life on the frontier." "People die," Grace agreed. "But they shouldn't die from treatable conditions because Their doctor doesn't recognize symptoms or prescribes inappropriate treatments. Are you accusing me of malpractice? I'm suggesting that your diagnostic and treatment methods might benefit from review by other medical professionals. Walsh turned to Sheriff Brennan with obvious desperation. Sheriff, this woman is clearly delusional. She's dangerous to the health and safety of this community. But before Brennan could respond, Sarah appeared in the doorway of the house, moving slowly in her chair, but with obvious determination. Dr. Walsh, she said clearly, I'd like to ask you some questions about my treatment. Walsh looked annoyed by the interruption. Miss Crawford, you should be resting. The tonic I prescribed is making me sicker instead of better, and I'd like to know why. Sarah, Nathan said with concern, you don't need to. Yes, I do. Sarah's voice was weak but determined. Dr. Walsh, for 6 months you've been telling me that my condition is deteriorating naturally and there's nothing to be done about it. But in 2 days, Grace has helped me more than all your treatments combined. Miss Crawford, you're obviously suffering from confusion brought on by your condition. It's common for patients to become paranoid about their medical care. I'm not paranoid and I'm not confused. I'm asking direct questions about why your treatments aren't working. Grace watched the exchange with growing admiration for Sarah's courage and growing concern about Walsh's responses. His dismissive attitude toward patient questions was not only unprofessional, it was suspicious. Dr. Walsh, Grace said quietly, perhaps you could explain your diagnosis of Sarah's condition. What exactly do you believe is causing her symptoms? Her symptoms are consistent with progressive deterioration of spinal injury complications. What kind of complications? General systemic failure associated with long-term disability. Grace felt her professional training react to the vague, meaningless diagnosis. Could you be more specific? Which systems are failing and through what mechanisms? Walsh's face reddened again. I don't have to explain complex medical concepts to someone without proper training. Actually, Sheriff Brennan said unexpectedly, I think I'd like to hear those explanations too. If Sarah's getting sicker, I want to understand why. Walsh looked trapped between his inability to provide coherent medical explanations and his need to maintain authority over his patients. Sheriff, he said finally, medical practice is complex. Lay people can't be expected to understand the nuances of diagnosis and treatment. Try me, Brennan replied. I may not have medical training, but I understand when someone's avoiding a direct question. The confrontation was interrupted by the arrival of another wagon, this one carrying Mrs. Hartwell and 2 other women from town. All 3 looked grim, and Grace immediately suspected they'd brought news that would change everything. Dr. Walsh, Mrs. Hartwell called as she climbed down from the wagon. We need to talk to you. Mary Patterson died this morning. Walsh's face went white. Mary Patterson, but I just saw her yesterday. Her condition was stable. Her condition was terrible, and it's been getting worse for weeks despite your treatments. Mrs. Hartwell turned to Grace. Miss Thornton, Mary's symptoms were exactly like what you described yesterday. Headaches, vision problems, confusion. She'd been taking Dr. Walsh's tonic for months. Grace felt her heart sink. Another patient with symptoms similar to Sarah's, another death that might have been preventable with proper diagnosis and treatment. How many patients does that make? Sheriff Brennan asked quietly. 5 in the past 3 months, Mrs. Hartwell replied. All women, all treated by Dr. Walsh for what he called nervous conditions or female complaints. The sheriff turned to Walsh with obvious suspicion. Doc, that seems like a lot of deaths for a small community. Frontier life is hard on women, Walsh said defensively. Their delicate constitutions aren't suited for the rigors of territorial living. Or, Grace said quietly, 5 women died because their symptoms were misdiagnosed and improperly treated by someone who doesn't have the training to recognize serious medical conditions. The accusation was direct and unmistakable. Walsh stared at Grace with undisguised hatred. You have no right to question my medical judgment. You're not a physician. Actually, Grace said, meeting his gaze steadily, I am. The admission sent a shock through the assembled group. Nathan looked surprised despite their earlier conversation, and Sheriff Brennan's eyebrows shot up. You're a doctor, Mrs. Hartwell asked with obvious hope. I'm a physician trained at Boston Medical College. I have experience in surgery, internal medicine, and the diagnosis of neurological conditions. That's impossible, Walsh sputtered. Women can't be physicians. Women can't be physicians in most places because men like you refuse to accept our training and credentials. But inability to practice openly doesn't negate the education and experience. Grace turned to address the group as a whole. I believe the women who died were suffering from treatable conditions that were misdiagnosed as incurable nervous disorders. I believe Sarah has a similar condition that can be successfully treated with proper intervention. And what kind of intervention would that be? Sheriff Brennan asked. Surgery, a procedure to relieve increased pressure in the brain and restore normal fluid drainage. Brain surgery. Mrs. Hartwell looked alarmed. A established surgical procedure that I've performed successfully before. And if something goes wrong, Nathan asked? If something goes wrong during surgery, Sarah might die. But if we don't operate and my diagnosis is correct, she will definitely die, slowly and with months of unnecessary suffering. Walsh had been listening to this exchange with growing desperation. Sheriff, this woman is clearly insane. She's talking about performing brain surgery based on her delusion that she's a trained physician. Actually, Sheriff Brennan said thoughtfully, she sounds more like a trained physician than you do, Doc. When's the last time you gave us a clear explanation of what's wrong with any of your patients? I don't have to justify my methods to lay people, but you do have to justify them to territorial authorities, Brennan interrupted. And given how many patients you've lost lately, I think they're going to be very interested in reviewing your credentials and your treatment methods. Walsh's face went through a series of expressions: anger, fear, and finally a kind of desperate calculation. You're all making a terrible mistake, he said finally. This woman is dangerous. If you let her operate on Miss Crawford, you'll be accessories to murder. And if we let you continue treating her, Grace replied, we'll be accessories to negligent homicide. The confrontation had reached a point where someone had to make a decision, and Grace realized that someone was going to be Sarah herself. Sarah, she said gently, this is your choice. You can continue with Dr. Walsh's treatments, or you can let me examine you thoroughly, and if necessary, perform the surgery I think will save your life. Sarah looked around at the assembled group, her brother, the sheriff, the concerned townswomen, and the two people claiming medical authority over her care. Grace, she said clearly, I trust you. If you think surgery will help, I want you to do it. Walsh made one last desperate attempt to maintain control. Miss Crawford, you're not competent to make medical decisions in your condition. Dr. Walsh, Sarah interrupted with steel in her voice. I'm perfectly competent to decide who I trust with my life. And I trust the woman who's helped me more in 2 days than you've helped me in 6 months. Sheriff Brennan nodded slowly. That settles it then. Miss Thornton, if you're really a doctor, I guess it's time to prove it. Grace felt the weight of decision settling on her shoulders. In the next few hours, she would either save Sarah's life or destroy everything she'd tried to build in Wyoming. But as she looked at the young woman's determined face and thought about the other women who died from preventable conditions, she knew there was only one choice she could live with. All right, she said quietly, let's get started. The next few hours passed in a blur of preparation that brought back all of Grace's medical training while highlighting the challenges of performing surgery under frontier conditions. Nathan cleared the largest room in the house, setting up tables and arranging lighting that would allow Grace to work with maximum visibility. Mrs. Hartwell proved invaluable in organizing community support, sending word throughout Cedar Ridge that prayers were requested for Sarah Crawford and assistance was needed for the medical procedure that might save her life. Women began arriving with clean linens, boiled water, and offers to help however they could. Dr. Walsh had left in a fury after Sheriff Brennan made it clear that he would not interfere with Grace's treatment of Sarah. But his parting words had been ominous. When this woman kills Sarah Crawford, her blood will be on all your hands. Grace tried to push those words from her mind as she prepared her instruments and reviewed the surgical procedure she hadn't performed in 6 months. The operation itself was straightforward in theory, creating a small opening to relieve pressure and insert a drainage tube. But any brain surgery carried significant risk, especially under the primitive conditions available on a frontier ranch. Grace, Nathan said as she completed her examination of Sarah's condition, "Are you certain this is necessary?" Grace looked up from the notes she'd been making. "I'm certain that without surgery, Sarah will be dead within a month. The pressure in her brain is increasing, and it's already affecting her vision and cognitive function. And with surgery, she has a good chance of complete recovery. The procedure I'm planning has a high success rate when performed before permanent damage occurs. Sarah, who had been resting while Grace prepared, opened her eyes and looked at both of them. Are you having second thoughts? I'm having all the thoughts, Nathan replied honestly. This is the most important decision I've ever had to make, and I'm terrified of making the wrong choice. Nathan, Sarah said gently, for 6 months I've been getting sicker and weaker while Dr. Walsh told us there was nothing to be done. Grace has given me more hope in 2 days than I've had in half a year. But if something goes wrong, at least we'll know we tried. At least we didn't just give up and wait for me to die. Grace felt a surge of admiration for Sarah's courage. Facing brain surgery would be frightening for anyone, but Sarah was approaching it with remarkable calmness and determination. Sarah, she said, I want to make sure you understand exactly what I'm going to do and what the risks are. For the next 30 minutes, Grace explained the procedure in detail, describing how she would create a small opening in Sarah's skull to access the area where fluid was accumulating and insert a drainage tube that would allow normal pressure to be restored. The surgery itself should take about 2 hours, she concluded. Recovery will be gradual, but if everything goes well, you should begin feeling better within days. And if everything doesn't go well, Grace met Sarah's gaze directly. If complications arise during surgery, there's a risk of bleeding infection or damage to surrounding brain tissue. In the worst case, those complications could be fatal. What are the odds of complications under ideal conditions with proper equipment and assistance? The risk would be relatively low. Under our current conditions, Grace paused, choosing her words carefully. The risk is higher, but still acceptable given the alternative. Sarah nodded slowly. Then let's do it. Are you sure? I'm sure, Grace. I've been dying slowly for months. If you can give me a chance at real life, I'm willing to take the risk. As afternoon faded into evening, the house filled with people who'd come to support the Crawford family through the crisis. Sheriff Brennan remained to provide official oversight, while Mrs. Hartwell coordinated the practical support that would be essential for the surgery. But just as Grace was making final preparations, an unexpected visitor arrived, Dr. Walsh, accompanied by 2 men who looked like they had official authority. Miss Thornton, one of the men called as he approached the house. I'm Judge Harrison from the Territorial Court. I need to speak with you about the medical procedure you are planning. Grace felt her heart sink. She'd hoped to complete the surgery before Walsh could organize official interference. Judge Harrison, she replied, I'm preparing to perform a life-saving medical procedure on Sarah Crawford. Time is critical. That's exactly what I need to discuss with you. Dr. Walsh has filed a complaint alleging that you're practicing medicine without proper credentials and endangering Miss Crawford's life. Sheriff Brennan stepped forward. Judge, with all due respect, Dr. Walsh's own treatment methods are what's been endangering lives in this community. That may be, but legal procedures must be followed. Miss Thornton, I need to see your medical credentials and licensing documentation. Grace had been preparing for this moment since revealing her true profession. She pulled out a leather portfolio and handed it to the judge. My diploma from Boston Medical College, my certificates of completion for surgical training, and documentation of my medical practice in Massachusetts. Judge Harrison examined the papers carefully, his eyebrows rising as he read. These appear to be legitimate credentials for a fully trained physician. They are legitimate credentials, Grace confirmed. Then why has Dr. Walsh been claiming you have no medical training? Dr. Walsh stepped forward with obvious agitation. Judge, those papers may be forgeries. Women cannot be trained as physicians. Actually, Dr. Walsh, Judge Harrison replied dryly, women can be and have been trained as physicians. The question is whether these particular credentials are valid. He turned back to Grace. Miss Thornton, these documents show impressive qualifications. Why didn't you identify yourself as a physician when you arrived in Cedar Ridge? Grace had hoped to avoid this conversation, but she owed everyone involved the complete truth. Because 6 months ago, a patient died during a surgical procedure I performed in Boston. The patient's family blamed me for the death, and the hospital where I worked suggested I might be happier practicing elsewhere. Were you found guilty of malpractice? No formal charges were filed, but the professional pressure made it impossible for me to continue practicing in Massachusetts. Judge Harrison absorbed this information thoughtfully. And now you want to perform the same type of surgery that resulted in your patient's death. I want to perform a procedure that will save Sarah Crawford's life. The patient who died in Boston had a much more advanced condition that had gone undiagnosed for months. Sarah's condition is still treatable. How can you be certain? Because I've been trained to recognize the symptoms and I understand the progression of the disease. Judge, every day we delay increases the risk of permanent damage or death. Walsh had been listening to this exchange with growing desperation. Judge Harrison, even if this woman has some medical training, she's talking about performing brain surgery under primitive frontier conditions. It's madness. What's madness, Mrs. Hartwell interrupted, is letting more women die because the only doctor in town doesn't know how to properly diagnose their conditions. Judge Harrison looked surprised by the older woman's vehemence. Mrs. Hartwell, what exactly are you referring to? I'm referring to the fact that 5 women have died in the past 3 months under Dr. Walsh's care, all with similar symptoms, all misdiagnosed as nervous conditions. That's a serious allegation. It's a serious problem. And it's why we're grateful to have a real doctor here who might be able to prevent more unnecessary deaths. Sheriff Brennan stepped forward. Judge, I've been investigating Dr. Walsh's practice and I have concerns about his credentials and his treatment methods. What kind of concerns? The kind that make me wonder whether he's actually qualified to practice medicine in this territory. Dr. Walsh's face went pale. Sheriff, this is outrageous. My credentials are properly filed with territorial authorities. Actually, Sheriff Brennan said grimly, they're not. I sent a telegram to the Territorial Medical Board yesterday. They have no record of anyone named Ezra Walsh being licensed to practice medicine in Wyoming territory. The revelation sent a shock through the assembled group. Judge Harrison looked sharply at Walsh. Dr. Walsh, is that true? There must be some mistake in the records. The only mistake, Grace said quietly, is that this community has been allowing an unlicensed practitioner to treat patients while preventing a properly trained physician from providing care. Judge Harrison studied Walsh's face, clearly recognizing signs of guilt and deception. Dr. Walsh, I'm going to need you to provide documentation of your medical training and licensing immediately. Judge, this is a witch hunt organized by a woman who wants to practice medicine illegally. Miss Thornton's credentials appear to be legitimate, the judge interrupted. Yours apparently are not. Sheriff Brennan, I think you need to investigate Dr. Walsh's background thoroughly. As the implications of Walsh's fraudulent practice became clear, Grace felt a mixture of vindication and urgency. Sarah's condition was worsening by the hour, and the legal complications had already delayed the surgery longer than was safe. Judge Harrison, she said, now that my credentials have been verified, may I proceed with Sarah's surgery? The delay has already increased the risks. Judge Harrison looked at Walsh, who was clearly preparing to flee, rather than face investigation, then back at Grace. Miss Thornton, you have my authorization to proceed with whatever medical treatment you deem necessary for Miss Crawford. And if something goes wrong, then you'll be held to the same standards as any licensed physician. But based on what I've seen here today, you are far more qualified to make medical decisions than the man who's been posing as this community's doctor. As Dr. Walsh hurried away with Sheriff Brennan in pursuit, Grace finally had the clear authority she needed to save Sarah's life. But the delays had cost precious time, and Sarah's symptoms had continued to worsen while they dealt with legal complications. Nathan, she said urgently, we need to begin immediately. Sarah's condition is deteriorating faster than I anticipated. Nathan looked at his sister, who was now clearly suffering from increased pressure that was affecting her ability to speak and focus. Do whatever you need to do, he said firmly. Just save her. Grace spent the next hour in final preparations, sterilizing instruments and preparing the makeshift operating room. Mrs. Hartwell proved invaluable as an assistant, following Grace's instructions with the competence of someone who understood the importance of proper surgical procedures. As Grace prepared to begin the operation that would either save Sarah's life or confirm her worst fears about her own abilities, she felt the familiar combination of terror and determination that had always marked the most critical moments of her medical career. Sarah, she said gently, are you ready? Sarah, despite her obvious suffering, managed a weak smile. I've been ready for months. Let's do this. Grace administered the chloroform that would keep Sarah unconscious during the procedure then took a deep breath and made the first incision. For the next 2 hours, she worked with the focused intensity that had made her one of Boston's most promising young surgeons. The surgery was more complex than she'd anticipated. The fluid buildup was extensive, and she had to be extremely careful to avoid damaging surrounding tissue as she created the drainage pathway that would relieve the pressure. But gradually, as she worked, she could see signs that the procedure was succeeding. The swollen tissue began to return to normal appearance, and the drainage system she'd created was functioning properly. "How does it look?" Nathan asked quietly from where he was assisting by maintaining the lighting. "It looks like Sarah is going to be fine," Grace replied, allowing herself to feel cautious optimism for the first time in hours. When she finally completed the procedure and began closing the incision, Grace felt the profound satisfaction that came from using her skills to genuinely help someone. Sarah's vital signs were stable, the drainage system was working properly, and the pressure that had been threatening her life was now relieved. "Is it over?" Mrs. Hartwell asked softly. "The surgery is over. Now we wait for Sarah to wake up and see how she responds to the treatment." The waiting was the hardest part. For the next several hours, Grace monitored Sarah's condition while Nathan paced the house like a caged wolf. Mrs. Hartwell coordinated a steady stream of visitors who brought food, offered prayers, and provided the kind of community support that made frontier life survivable. Just as dawn was breaking over the mountains, Sarah opened her eyes and looked around with clear, focused vision. "Grace," she said softly, "did it work?" Grace felt tears of relief fill her eyes. "How do you feel?" "Different. Better. The headache is gone for the first time in months." Nathan knelt beside his sister's bed, his face showing the strain of the longest night of his life. "Sarah, how many fingers am I holding up?" "3, and Nathan, I can see them clearly. I can see everything clearly." Over the next few days, Sarah's recovery exceeded even Grace's most optimistic predictions. The young woman's strength returned rapidly, her cognitive function improved dramatically, and her spirits soared as she realized she was truly going to live. But perhaps the most significant change was in the community itself. Word of Grace's successful surgery spread throughout the territory, and people began arriving from distant towns seeking treatment for conditions that had been misdiagnosed or ignored by other practitioners. "Grace," Nathan said one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, "you realize you can't go back to being just a rancher's wife, don't you?" Grace looked at the steady stream of patients who had made camp near their house, waiting to consult with the woman who brought real medical care to the frontier. "I know, but Nathan, this isn't what you bargained for when you sent for a mail-order bride." Nathan took her hand and squeezed it gently. "I bargained for a partner who could help me care for Sarah. What I got was a woman who's saving lives throughout the territory. And you're all right with being married to a physician instead of a traditional wife." Nathan smiled. "Grace, I fell in love with you the moment you risked everything to save my sister's life. The fact that you're brilliant enough to be a physician just makes me prouder to be your husband. Even though it means our life together will be complicated by medical emergencies and patients who need care at all hours. Even though it means our life together will be devoted to something bigger than ourselves." 3 months later, Dr. Grace Crawford, she'd taken Nathan's name after their proper wedding ceremony, opened the first medical clinic in Cedar Ridge, with Sarah serving as her capable assistant and Nathan managing the business aspects of her growing practice. Dr. Walsh had disappeared into the night after Sheriff Brennan began investigating his fraudulent credentials, but his departure had left the community with a new appreciation for properly trained medical care. "Dr. Crawford," Sarah said one morning as they prepared for another busy day of patient consultations, "do you ever regret leaving Boston? Do you miss the sophisticated medical facilities and the colleagues who shared your training?" Grace looked around the clinic they'd built together, simple but clean, equipped with the essentials for frontier medical practice, and filled with patients who trusted her with their lives. "Sarah, in Boston, I was always fighting for recognition and acceptance. Here, I'm valued for what I can do rather than judged for what I'm not supposed to be able to do." "And the patient you lost, do you still think about them?" "Every day, but I've learned that the best way to honor that patient's memory is to save as many other lives as possible." As Grace prepared for her morning rounds, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from the sophisticated medical institutions of Boston to a frontier clinic where she was not only accepted, but celebrated for her skills. She'd come west, running from failure and hoping for a chance to hide. Instead, she'd found love, family, and the opportunity to practice medicine in a community that valued her abilities above social conventions. Mrs. Crawford called a voice from the clinic's waiting area. "There's a family here from Denver asking if you could examine their daughter. They've heard about the woman doctor who performs miracles in Cedar Ridge." Grace smiled as she gathered her medical bag. Miracles were simply the result of proper training, careful diagnosis, and the courage to act when action was needed. But as she went to meet her new patients, she realized that sometimes the greatest miracle was finding a place where you could be exactly who you were meant to be. That evening, as she and Nathan sat together on their porch while Sarah played piano in the parlor, Grace reflected on the unexpected happiness she'd found in Wyoming territory. "Nathan," she said softly, "when you advertised for a mail-order bride with medical knowledge, did you ever imagine you'd end up married to a doctor?" "I imagined I'd end up married to someone who could help me save Sarah's life," he replied. "The fact that you turned out to be the most brilliant woman in the territory was just a bonus. And now I'm married to the woman I love. Sarah is healthy and happy, and our community has the medical care it deserves. I'd say that's a pretty successful mail-order marriage." Grace leaned against her husband's shoulder and listened to the sound of Sarah's music drifting through the evening air. She'd lost her first medical career to prejudice and self-doubt, but she'd found something better. A place where her skills were valued, a family who loved her for exactly who she was, and the confidence to practice medicine without apology or compromise. The heart she had discovered was indeed wise enough to lead people home, even when home turned out to be a place they'd never imagined could exist. Thank you for joining Grace, Nathan, and Sarah on their journey of healing, love, and courage. If you enjoyed this story of finding your true calling while building a family through choice and love, please like and subscribe for more inspiring Western romance stories that prove the greatest beauty comes from a heart dedicated to serving others.